What if I told you that Tom Bombadil once stood face to face with Saruman the White, not during the War of the Ring, not as enemies locked in battle, but in a secret meeting that happened centuries before Saruman's corruption became complete? This isn't speculation pulled from thin air. This is a theory built from the careful analysis of Tolkien's deeper writings, the gaps between his published works, and the subtle hints scattered throughout Middle-earth's recorded history. Today we're diving into one of the most overlooked possibilities in all of Tolkien's legendarium. A meeting between two of the most enigmatic figures in Middle-earth, at a time when one still wore white robes with genuine purpose, and the other had already been singing in his forest since before the world grew old. This encounter might explain not just why Tom Bombadil remained untouched by the growing darkness, but also how Saruman's fall began long before anyone realized it was happening. Let's start with what we know about timing. Saruman arrived in Middle-earth around the year 1000 of the Third Age, sent by the Valar as one of the Istari. His mission was clear: guide and counsel the free peoples in their struggle against Sauron's growing power. But here's what's fascinating. For nearly 2,000 years, Saruman operated with genuine purpose. He studied, he learned, he fought against the shadow. His corruption didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, almost imperceptible, like a slow poison working through his spirit. Tom Bombadil, meanwhile, had been in his forest since time immemorial. Gandalf tells us Tom was there before the Elves awoke, before Sauron ever served Morgoth, before the very concept of the Rings of Power existed. Tom represents something foundational to Middle-earth itself, a connection to the music of creation that shaped the world. So when Saruman began his deep studies into the nature of power, into the workings of the rings, into the fundamental forces that govern dominion and control, wouldn't it make sense for him to seek out the one being who predates all of it? Consider Saruman's character. In his early years, he wasn't the scheming traitor we see in The Lord of the Rings. He was Saruman the White, head of the White Council, respected by Gandalf, trusted by Elrond. His corruption began with intellectual curiosity, with a desire to understand his enemy so completely that he could defeat him. Saruman believed that to destroy evil, one must first comprehend it fully. This philosophical approach would naturally lead him to seek out ancient sources of knowledge, beings who had witnessed the very foundations of power being laid. Picture this scenario. It's sometime in the middle of the Third Age, perhaps around the year 1600, when Saruman has spent centuries studying in Gondor and Rohan, but hasn't yet claimed Isengard as his stronghold. His research into the nature of dominion and the Rings of Power has reached a dead end. The books and scrolls can only tell him so much. He needs to speak with someone who was actually there when these fundamental forces were first unleashed upon the world. Saruman would have heard whispers of Tom Bombadil, stories told by the few who had encountered him. An ancient being living in the old forest, immune to the power of rings, master of his own domain in ways that defied understanding. For a scholar like Saruman, such a figure would represent an irresistible source of primordial knowledge. The journey to find Tom wouldn't have been simple, even for one of the Istari. The old forest doesn't welcome uninvited guests, and its paths shift according to the will of its master. But Saruman, at this point in his life, still possessed the patience and wisdom that made him worthy of his mission. He would have approached not as a conqueror, but as a seeker, following the old protocols of respectful inquiry that govern meetings between ancient powers. When they finally met, it wouldn't have been in battle or confrontation. Tom Bombadil doesn't fight in the traditional sense. He simply is with such fundamental certainty that opposing forces find themselves unable to take hold. Saruman, arriving with genuine scholarly intent, would have been received not as an enemy, but as a curious visitor. Tom might have welcomed him with his characteristic blend of cheerfulness and ancient wisdom, perhaps offering food and drink while they spoke of deep matters under the old trees. Their conversation would have centered on the nature of power itself. Saruman, seeking to understand how rings of dominion could be forged and how their influence could be resisted, would have found in Tom a living example of absolute immunity to such forces. When Frodo later offers Tom the One Ring, Tom slips it on and nothing happens. He doesn't vanish, he doesn't fall under its influence, he simply laughs. This isn't ignorance or innocence. This is the response of someone who understands exactly what the ring is and has already rejected everything it represents. Tom would have explained to Saruman that true power doesn't come from domination or control over others. It comes from being so completely yourself, so rooted in your own nature that external forces simply cannot find purchase. Tom is master of his domain not because he conquered it or bent it to his will, but because he and the forest exist in perfect harmony. He shapes it, and it shapes him in an endless dance that began before the first sunrise and will continue until the world's end. This lesson would have been both illuminating and frustrating for Saruman. On one hand, it provided him with crucial insight into how the enemy's power worked and how it might be resisted. Tom's immunity to the ring revealed that Sauron's dominion, however vast, was not absolute. There were ways to stand outside his influence, to remain free even in a world increasingly under shadow. But the lesson also planted a dangerous seed in Saruman's mind. If power could be resisted through complete self-mastery, then perhaps it could also be wielded more effectively through the same principle. Saruman began to believe that his own corruption was impossible because he understood the mechanisms of power so thoroughly. He convinced himself that he could use the enemy's tools without falling victim to the enemy's influence. Tom Bombadil, ancient as he was, would have seen the potential danger in Saruman's thinking. The wizard's questions revealed not just intellectual curiosity but an underlying hunger, a desire not merely to understand power, but to possess it more perfectly than anyone before him. Tom might have warned Saruman about this path, speaking in his characteristic riddles and songs about the fate of those who believe themselves immune to the very forces they seek to control. But warnings delivered in verse and metaphor often fail to penetrate minds convinced of their own wisdom. Saruman left the old forest with exactly the knowledge he had sought, but also with a fatal misunderstanding of what that knowledge meant. He had learned that power could be resisted, but he interpreted this as meaning that he personally could wield power without being corrupted by it. The irony is profound. Tom Bombadil's example of immunity to the ring's influence gave Saruman the confidence to eventually seek out his own ring of power. Tom's demonstration that the enemy's dominion was not absolute encouraged Saruman to believe he could stand as an equal opponent to Sauron. The very encounter that should have taught Saruman humility instead fed his growing pride. Years passed, perhaps centuries, before the full consequences of this meeting became apparent. Saruman established himself at Isengard, began breeding his Uruk-hai, and started his slow transformation from protector to predator. He convinced himself at each step that he was still serving the greater good, that his methods, however harsh, were necessary to defeat an enemy too dangerous to face with conventional approaches. The breaking point came when Saruman finally obtained a Palantir, one of the seeing stones of Númenor. Through this ancient artifact, he made contact with Sauron himself, believing his understanding of power's true nature would protect him from corruption. But in that moment of contact, all his careful theories collapsed. The Dark Lord's influence didn't work through the crude mechanisms of dominion that Saruman had studied. It worked through the subtle manipulation of pride, the gradual erosion of moral boundaries, the slow transformation of good intentions into evil actions. Saruman found himself trapped not by force but by his own certainty that he could not be trapped. His meeting with Tom Bombadil, which should have taught him the value of simple, rooted existence, instead became the foundation for a complex philosophy that justified any action in service of what he saw as ultimate victory. Meanwhile, Tom Bombadil continued his timeless existence in the old forest, unchanged and unchanging. When the War of the Ring finally came, he helped Frodo and his companions, not through grand gestures, but through simple presence. He saved them from Old Man Willow and the Barrow-wights not because he opposed the forces of darkness in any organized way, but because he existed as a constant reminder of what life could be when it remained true to its own nature. The contrast between Tom and Saruman at the war's end is stark. Saruman, for all his knowledge and power, had become a hollow shell capable only of spite and destruction. Tom remained exactly what he had always been, a joyful, singing presence celebrating the simple fact of existence itself. One had tried to master power and been mastered by it. The other had never sought power at all and therefore remained forever free. But there's another layer to this story, one that reveals itself in the details of how Saruman's defeat finally came about. When Saruman was cast out of the White Council and stripped of his rank, it wasn't through superior force or cunning strategy. It was through the simple act of Gandalf speaking his true name and revealing his true nature. The power of truth, spoken clearly and without malice, proved stronger than all of Saruman's accumulated might. This echoes the kind of power Tom Bombadil wielded in the Old Forest. When he commanded Old Man Willow to release the hobbits, he didn't use force or threats. He simply spoke with such authority, such complete certainty of who he was and what he represented, that even the malevolent tree had no choice but to obey. Tom's power came not from domination, but from absolute authenticity. If Saruman had truly understood the lesson Tom offered during their ancient meeting, he might have recognized this pattern. He might have realized that his growing need for servants and armies and fortresses was actually a sign of weakness, not strength. True power requires no external validation because it springs from an unshakable knowledge of one's own nature and purpose. Instead, Saruman's fall accelerated precisely because he had learned just enough about power to be dangerous to himself. His encounter with Tom Bombadil had given him the confidence to believe he could handle forces that had corrupted beings far greater than any wizard. He had seen immunity to domination and mistaken it for a technique he could master rather than a state of being he would need to embody. The meeting between Tom Bombadil and Saruman, if it happened as we've imagined, would have been one of those pivotal moments that shaped the course of history, not through dramatic action, but through subtle influence. A conversation between two ancient minds, one rooted in joy and the other increasingly drawn to control, that set in motion a chain of consequences spanning centuries. By the time readers encounter Saruman in The Lord of the Rings, he has become everything Tom Bombadil is not, grasping where Tom is content, scheming where Tom is straightforward, desperate for control, where Tom needs no dominion beyond his own forest. The wizard who once sought wisdom from the forest's master had transformed into his spiritual opposite, proving that knowledge without wisdom, power without humility, and ambition without love lead inevitably to corruption. Tom Bombadil represents something that exists outside the normal patterns of Middle-earth's history. He doesn't grow or change or struggle against fate because he has achieved a kind of perfect equilibrium with existence itself. He is what Saruman might have become if he had truly learned the lesson of that ancient meeting, that the greatest power lies not in mastering others, but in being so completely yourself that mastery becomes irrelevant. This interpretation adds new depth to Tom's role in the larger story. He's not just a curious anomaly or a remnant of older days, he's a living example of the road not taken, the choice that Saruman and countless others throughout Middle-earth's history failed to make. He shows us what it looks like to remain uncorrupted not through strength or vigilance, but through such complete acceptance of one's own nature that corruption simply cannot find a foothold. The tragedy of Saruman becomes even more poignant when viewed through this lens. He was offered the greatest gift imaginable, a glimpse of true freedom, genuine power, authentic existence. But because he approached it as a problem to be solved rather than a state to be embraced, he turned the very medicine that could have saved him into the poison that ultimately destroyed him. Tom Bombadil continued singing in his forest, unchanged by the meeting that may have doomed one of the wisest beings ever to walk Middle-earth. Because for Tom, every moment is complete in itself. Every song contains all the wisdom anyone could ever need, and every day in the forest is both the first day of the world and the last day that will ever be necessary. In the end, the secret meeting between Tom Bombadil and Saruman tells us something profound about the nature of corruption and resistance in Tolkien's world. It's not the great and obvious evils that damn us, but the subtle pride that whispers we can handle anything, understand everything, master any force without being mastered in return. Tom Bombadil stands as eternal proof that there's another way, the way of joyful acceptance, rooted presence, and the simple courage to be exactly who you are, no more and no less, forever and always. It's a lesson that Saruman learned but failed to understand, and in that failure lies one of the great tragedies of Middle-earth's long history.